Hello and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again, as always, on the program today. Just a quick reminder that Justin Center as an organization is supported by donors. So if you don't already contribute to the work that we do and you appreciate this, please go to justincenter.org, go to our donate page. Once again, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that any gifts that you do choose to give us are tax deductible. Just a reminder also, so to some of you who watch on YouTube, if you have not subscribed, make sure you do that and make sure you subscribe on your podcast app as well. Okay, we're going to jump right into the topic today. And the topic that I'm going to be discussing is one that may seem a little kind of out of what I usually talk about here, but there's certainly a reason for it. And that is, I'm going to be discussing Richard Reeves' recent book of Boys and Men. Now, why am I talking about that on a theology podcast? Well, the reason for that is that, this is an issue that the church has to address as much as anybody else. What's going on with boys and men today in our culture and the real crisis that men are facing. It's something that has been very important for my own ministry, as a lot of my ministry has been with specifically kind of college-age men and equipping college-age men to deal with life from a Christian perspective. And I'm having a lot of conversations about men and manhood pretty regularly. And these are the kinds of conversations that are happening in the church all over the place. So if you spend any amount of time on social media, Christian social media, especially like Christian Twitter, there are a lot of arguments about manhood and patriarchy and what exactly men should be and do according to the church and what men shouldn't be and shouldn't do. And I think with the rise of the kind of manosphere that you have today, especially with the likes of, Andrew Tate and some of these kind of more extreme people, these are just conversations that everybody's having for all sorts of reasons. Now, I have dealt in the past with, I did a podcast series on the I think it was only 2 programs. I actually recorded the 3rd at the time, and then the file something happened to it and got deleted, so never made it. But I did do a series of podcasts, this is a number of years ago now, on the Christian patriarchy movement. And in those podcasts, I spent some time reading proponents of the Christian patriarchy movement, and I was going through a statement that some of those individuals had created. Now, when I'm talking about the Christian patriarchy movement, I'm talking about like Vision Forum. There's a very particular set of ideas that surround that. With Doug Phillips, that's no longer extant, but I was critical of that movement. And if you want to go back and listen to those, you can. I don't remember what I said in them, so don't hold me to it now. No, I really don't remember much of all of what I said. But I would remain critical of that movement if I did that today. But as I've listened to, say, like the Mars Hill podcast, dealing with Mark Driscoll and some of the fallout from that, there's a lot of criticism of Driscoll because of his speaking to man and the way that he did that, and he's seen as kind of this example of a toxic masculinity, if you're using that kind of language. And in terms of Driscoll, I think certainly he was very obviously and clearly abusing power, was narcissistic, remains to be so today. There are plenty of issues that are just really apparent. So, I think that the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast pointed out a lot of real issues. But as I listened to that podcast and a lot of the discourse surrounding it, one of the things that I think I was disappointed by was that they weren't really, a lot of the individuals talking about the podcast in particular, and I think this was true in it as well, didn't really acknowledge that there was something profound and good about what Driscoll was saying to men. In that the reason his ministry was so successful is that he was empowering men in a lot of significant ways. Now, that wasn't always in a good way, but sometimes it was. Not like everything Driscoll said was bad. There was a reason why he was as successful as he was, and not all of that was bad. So there are real issues, I think, that men are facing today that someone like Driscoll helped to really point out, which led to his rise to fame. Now, certainly, if you think more recently, Jordan Peterson is probably the most significant individual that's been addressing issues that men are facing in our culture today. I can just say, as one who works on college campus with men, and for those who don't know, I did work full time on campus at Cornell University, and doing ministry, like chaplaincy kind of work there. I'm not doing that anymore in a full-time capacity. I'm not getting paid for work there, but I am still involved with a couple of different ministries, organizations, working with students there. And that's something I volunteer my time with because I care about it deeply. And that involves largely, mentoring men. So as I've spent a lot of time with younger guys, Peterson comes up all the time. he's been a highly influential figure because he's pushed men toward an understanding of responsibility, in particular, meaning and purpose in life. And I've seen now multiple instances of individuals who get interested in his work and then start studying scripture, getting involved or interested in questions about the faith, and then eventually coming to faith. So that's something that I've seen at numerous points. Now, that I want to set that up just as a background, is to say this is why I think these issues matter. It clearly matters for men. It clearly matters especially for young men. And if you don't address these issues, what is going to happen is that men are going to get angry. And this is happening all over the place. I mean, you see this with, all of the very angry, anon accounts on Twitter that, go off and harass women about this or that, because these men are fueled by anger. And the anger that fuels them, it's not right to just say, you're evil, but we need to actually ask, is there a place that this is genuinely coming from? Is there genuine kind of hurt, societal issues, psychological issues that we're seeing that are leading to the rise of this kind of behavior among certain men? And I think that's absolutely the case. So if we're not addressing these issues as Christians from a biblical perspective, and we're not reaching out to men in a way that empowers them, and if we're just echoing what the culture is saying about toxic masculinity and whatnot, all we're going to do is drive men into these kind of extremist movements, because what the heck else are they supposed to do? They're angry. And in some ways the anger is justified. In some ways it's not, but we could talk about that. So Richard Reeves' book of Boys and Men is what I want to use as kind of the foundation for discussing what's going on culturally with men. And what I found really interesting about Richard Reeves is he's not a conservative author. And he comes across, reading his book, he comes across very much as a moderate. I think he would consider himself more of a liberal. He works for the Brookings Institute, and not known for being a very conservative organization. He's not writing for like the Heritage Foundation or something. So that makes it interesting that someone from a very different perspective is starting to see a lot of the same issues. Now, certainly I'm coming from a more conservative perspective myself, but I really appreciate that he is willing to see these issues and speak about these issues as he sees them, even though it's inevitable that there's going to be a lot of pushback from those on the left, which he considers himself to be. So I would say, reading the book, he really comes across probably as more moderate than anything else, but nonetheless, he's not. He's an individual that you can't accuse of being on. Well, you can, I guess, but on the far right of things. So what I want to do is just explore some of the things that he does in terms of psychological research, how things are difficult in our society for men. And, these are things that many of you, it's not going to be the first time you've heard this. I've looked at these statistics plenty of times in plenty of places. But I think he does a really good job kind of compiling the research and compiling all of the information that we have about what's going on now. So it's a really great, I think summary work. Now, Reeves identifies what are three areas in which men are at a profound disadvantage in our society today. And that is, one, the structure of the educational system. And he's going to have his own proposals about how we shift that in terms of education. And I can't tell you that I have all of the answers to all of these kinds of questions. That's kind of beyond my field. But because I'm interested in this largely for the sake of how we deal with this in the church, because that's my my vocation and calling. And then second, the economic shift away from what are traditionally male jobs to other jobs. And then third, the cultural role of family provider is now gone. The family structure is very different than it was. Now, someone like Reeves is not necessarily always going to see that as a bad thing. He's trying to say that men kind of are going to need to adapt to new family structures and new jobs. Whereas I'm certainly more of a traditionalist, so I would argue instead for recapturing of some of the older perspectives on family and gender and things like that. But nonetheless, so let's start jumping into what some of these things are to look at what men are facing today. Now Reeves is consistently going to talk throughout this book about how, yes, there have been inequalities for women. So he's not going to deny that there have been inequalities, but what he's essentially saying is you can't fight any inequality from one group while, and in doing that, tearing another group down. And I think this is what you've seen with the feminist movements, and movements, because there's a lot to the different waves of feminism. But oftentimes the kind of empowering of women is done at the expense of men, right? It's tearing men down to lift women up. And I think you see this with a lot of movements, particularly on the left, that to speak to some marginalized group or oppressed group, you need to lift them up while putting some other group down. And when you're not concerned about the results of attacking one other group, what you create is just a bunch of very angry, bitter people on the other side. And now you have another hurt group that is not only now hurt, but now they're also being told that they're oppressors, even though they're completely disempowered. It is an ugly situation that we're seeing today, and it's kind of inevitable with a lot of the rhetoric that's being used. I mean, if you paint white males as the ultimate evil in society, and they can't get jobs, and they struggle with education, what are they going to do but get angry and become extremists? I mean, what are they supposed to do with those feelings? It should be obvious that these are the things that are going to happen. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on with some of the mental health issues. And it's very clear that men are struggling profoundly with depression. Men are struggling profoundly with feeling meaningless, like their life is meaningless. They feel like things are purposeless. They don't have drive. They don't have direction. They feel like they're not competent compared to their female counterparts who seem to be getting ahead and doing well. Okay, so this is statistically very clear. Men account for almost 3 of 4 deaths of despair. And what are counted as deaths of despair, suicide is the obvious one, but also overdoses. So out of 4 deaths from either an overdose from drugs or suicide, this is men. So that's a very significant statistic. So it shows you that there's something clearly going on with men in our society today that is leading to a really significant mental health crisis. There was a Australian study that Reeves talks about here, which asked for words that men who were suicidal, were at the point of suicide, used to describe themselves. And the 2 words that showed up more than anything else is useless, and worthless. And this, again, is very significant because men psychologically need to feel like they are useful. We need to feel like we are doing something for the world. Right? We need to feel like we're somebody needs us. And I think this is just, and when I talk about this, because I know people are going to say this, no, not all men are the same. No, not all women are the same. When we talk about generalities in psychological studies, we are talking about generalities of men. Not all men are the same. Not all women are the same. Obviously, there is a spectrum of personalities. And so, no, when I say this, I'm not identifying every single man. But we're talking about the generalities because that's what you have to do for when you're doing studies like this. Okay, so that's where we're at. So men generally, and this is all borne out in my own personal experience. Certainly, seeing doing marriage counseling and different things in pastoral ministry as well. So, think about the very common scenario that probably all married people know, where this is very common, where a wife is struggling with something and has a problem and then wants to talk to her husband about it and starts to, lay out what's going on. And what's the husband's first response? The husband's first response is, okay, well, here's how to fix it. Bam, bam, bam. Here's my plan. And the wife gets really annoyed and is like, I don't want you to fix it. I just want to talk to you about it. And I want you to listen. It's just we're created differently. So we generally have different needs. And the man's first thought tends to be, how can you use me? I want to be useful. My parents just came out to celebrate Christmas with us. And while my parents were here, my dad can't sit still and talk and wants to go out and shovel the driveway or do something at the house that's going to make him feel like he's doing something useful. Very common experience, because men generally need to be able to do things or to produce things to feel value. So they don't feel like there's any worth if they feel like they can't be useful. And what happens is when women step into those roles that men traditionally had, and they start to excel at them, men feel like, well, there's no need for me. I'm useless. Men like to feel needed, even in very, kind of small ways, which I know it's like, the joke that like, yeah, the guy needs, the wife needs to ask her husband if he can, open the pickle jar or whatever. But men psychologically like those kinds of times when they feel like they can do something that the woman can't do. And it doesn't mean because they want to have power over the woman. You could analyze this and make it sound evil, but the men like to feel like they have something good to offer. They want to feel like they can contribute something positive to society. So this is what's happening, I think, with the kind of gaming obsessions that men have, is because they feel worthless and useless in real society, and so they kind of close themselves off from real society, and then they feel like, well, at least I can do something in this video game. They're living a life that is not real because they're not getting any kind of value or worth in real life, because they're not being seen as useful. So and not that I'm not one of these guys that's like against video games. I play video games. I just think it's a matter of balance. Okay? I think it's a matter of not, anything can be an addiction. I think video games can be helpful, and you tell a good story. I think it's a positive storytelling medium, or can be at least, and can be a stress reliever and things like that. But when that becomes your sole life, when you're cut off from real life, it's extremely, extremely unhealthy. And I saw this when I was younger with like World of Warcraft. A lot of guys just shut themselves off. Guys that didn't do well in school, and it was largely those men who felt like they couldn't contribute anything. So it's like, well, at least I can kind of do it here. So how do we do this in the church then? What do we do here? And I think that the clear answer in terms of what we do in the church is like, give men things to do, make men feel like they are useful and needed in the church, encourage them, like spending time with, I say groups of young men and women, I say campus ministry that I've done. It's like the women are constantly saying nice things about each other, and they're constantly complimenting each other. And guys just don't naturally do that as much. And it's amazing how like one compliment toward a man that he's doing something well will have a profound effect upon him. Just encouraging them. You're good at this. You should keep doing that. We really need you to do this. Men in the church to just say, hey, it would be really great. I saw you had this skill. It'd be great if you would help us with this or that. When men feel like they have something to offer, they want to be involved more. But men need to be encouraged. And when all men are told is, you're toxic and you need to get out of the way, that's what's going to lead to this useless, worthless feeling. Another statistic that's important in terms of mental health, 15% of men say that they have no close friends. And it was 3% in 1990, so that's increased pretty significantly. To be honest, I think 15% sounds kind of low. I would picture that being a little bit higher. A lot of grown men especially, don't have close friends. They don't have close friends. Men don't, for whatever reason, don't do as well in friendships. A lot of men, especially after they get married, tend to, and this is true when guys have girlfriends. I mean, like when I was younger, it was always like, oh, the guy's got a girlfriend now, so he doesn't want to hang out with the dudes anymore. He doesn't want to hang out with the bros. But the fact is, like, men often kind of attach to their wife, and don't really reach out for male friendships, which is why then men do a lot worse psychologically when there's a death of a spouse. So statistically, men do far worse with the death of a spouse than women do. And I think a lot of that is because friendships are more difficult. So, that's, again, why things like video games, especially the kind of online gaming sphere, has been something that men have gotten interested in, because even though they're not like real in-person friendships, it's a community, and people are desperate for community, and men are desperate for community, and we're not good at doing it. And so traditionally you have things like, you have men's clubs, not gentlemen's clubs in the way that people use it today, but like a classic gentleman's club. You have, your Elks Lodge and all of these different groups that, and no, I know lodges have their issues. So I'm not promoting Masonic lodges or something. But my point is that there are clubs, there are groups where men are involved. There have been historically, and those just don't exist anymore. I would love to see some kind of classic gentlemen's clubs being something that is promoted in our society today. I'd love to recapture something like that. But as a church, we have to ask, well, how can we meet these needs? How can we create community for men? And that's something we have to very seriously be considering. And that means having separate time for men to get together and do things. Because men have to be encouraged to do that. Like, they're not going to go out of their way and seek relationships usually in the same way that women do. So the church needs to create those environments and actually bring people into those environments. Let's talk then about education. So there's some kind of the basic mental health stuff which underlies a lot of this, and I think just goes to show that, like, we're not making this up, that men really are facing some really serious issues today. And so when the entirety of your rhetoric is about, how women are oppressed and abused, and these men are just struggling with complete despair and depression and committing suicide, you're not helping a pretty significant portion of the population. Okay, so let's look then at education right now, where we're at. So, 100 years ago, there were women who were getting college educated, but the majority of people getting educated in college were men. Some women were, but generally women would prefer a domestic life, or at least that was the societal expectation. And now, though, for every 100 bachelor's degrees awarded to women, only 74 are awarded to men. So we've gone from a situation where almost all of the education is men to now women far excelling where men are at in terms of education. We're speaking specifically here about higher education. Okay, in 2020, there was a decline in college enrollment 7 times greater. So 2020, the college enrollment has faced serious issues for the past few years, and anybody involved in higher education knows that at this point. There are a lot of schools that have closed, a lot of schools that are really suffering financially, and there are a number of reasons for that. But this decline in college enrollment was 7 times greater for male than female students. 7 times. That is a really significant figure. And so men are less and less inclined to pursue higher education. And some of that, you could say, well, they're just kind of working hands-on jobs. That would be great if that was really the case. Now, in some cases that's what's happening, but there's far more to the story than that. Okay, so almost 1 in 4 boys, it's 23%, has a developmental disability. That's a lot. And it certainly makes me question how you define disabilities. And I'm certainly not the first person to say this, but a lot of things that are described as disabilities are very much just naturally how a lot of boys are, I think. So, we're dealing with mental disabilities, is like ADHD, for example. Like, men do tend to be more distracted. Men tend to need to be up and around and active more than women do. And again, we're talking about tendencies here. So I know the comments are going to be, but I'm a guy and I'm not like this, or I'm a woman and I'm like this. I know. I know. So these developmental disabilities, as at least they're labeled, make a lot of these men feel very disadvantaged. And, to be clear, I'm not saying there's no such thing as a real developmental disability, but I do think that we have to reconsider in some ways how we do education, in terms of how active, boys and girls are. For the majority of history, and you see this still in many communities today that are not, kind of modern westernized communities, any kind of more, communities where, boys are expected to kind of work from a very young age, to some degree. I watched, there's a cool YouTube series that is in, it follows this group of this family in like northern Russia. It's in Yakutia, I think is the name of it, and it follows this family. It's in like the coldest region, like inhabited region in the world, basically. And they follow this father and son, and the son is like, he walks with his father. He goes to school in the freezing cold, and then he goes with his dad to like go ice fishing, and he does everything with his dad. Like he's involved in the work like all day. And he looks so like delighted. It's a fun thing to watch because like the family, you see the closeness of the family and kind of this slow, like this kind of communal living that we just don't have in our, in our modern world in many places, but some places in the world like that do still have that. But you see like the joy that this kid gets, and boys get joy out of being productive. And they get joy out of being productive in ways that are more than just kind of sitting down and learning stuff. And so I think that we do have to consider that in terms of our education. And I think the church has adopted just modern views of education in general. So I think we all need to reconsider that in many ways. Now, to be fair, my boys can sit and listen to lectures and talks for a long time and they're fine. but I also recognize that I'm an academic and my wife is very much that way too. So it makes sense that our kids would have that kind of temperament. But that's not the temperament of like most boys. So we need to kind of rethink that. And I think rethink again as a church how we do that. All right, brain functions associated with impulse control. Here's something that he's going to bring up a lot in this book is that things happen at different ages for boys and girls generally. Okay, so brain functions associated with impulse control, planning, future orientation, which are things mostly in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, mature generally 2 years later in boys than girls. So the argument that he's going to make is in education, we are essentially privileging girls because we're expecting certain things that developmentally girls, because they develop earlier, are able to do, but boys are not. So they're put at a disadvantage automatically, just by the nature of how our education system works. And I'm not going to pretend that I have the answers educationally, but it is something that certainly we need to be considering. 57% of bachelor's degrees in the U.S. today are awarded to women. Now, 57% obviously is more than half, but we're seeing that gap increase. And I think that's a gap that we're going to continue to see between men and women, is that women are going to continue to pursue more higher education. And as women do that, men are going to be doing it less and less. Now, here's a statistic that is wild to me. Every single one of the top 16 law schools has a woman as editor-in-chief as of 2020. That is really significant. Really significant. That's imbalance. Right? If what you want is total equality of outcomes, so that you have just as many women as you do men, the individuals who are concerned about that don't tend to be concerned about things going the other way, like at all. And so if every one of the top 16 law schools has a woman as editor-in-chief, that doesn't seem very, very balanced. Okay, male students are at a higher risk of dropping out of college than any other group. So if you divide people into various demographic groups, now you could talk about poor versus rich students, or if you divide up black and white, U.S. born versus foreign born, however ethnically, however you want to divide it up. If you divide it up further into many ethnicities, the highest risk of dropping out, if you divide things that way, is always going to be the males. So there's something about males that men give up more easily. They give up when they don't feel encouraged. Just really showing, I think, the importance of encouraging men, that when they get a little bit of encouragement and are told that they're doing well, and men like need, and here's the thing with Mark Driscoll, like everybody can kind of make fun of his, screaming in his sermons at men. And not saying it's not over the top and ridiculous, but there's a reason why that resonated with dudes, because we kind of need someone to yell at us sometimes, or like kick our butts so that we get up and do the things we need to do. Like we need that. That's good for us. And so men need encouragement, but not always in the same way that women need encouragement. Sometimes men do just kind of need a kick in the pants. and that's good for us. And that often feels like men have a goal, right? When there's a critique, they're like, okay, I will listen and I'm going to do better. Men need to be goal-oriented. I think everybody needs to be goal-oriented, but men in particular we're talking about here. Okay, for every 100 bachelor's degrees awarded to women, 74 are awarded to men. Pretty significant discrepancy there between men and women. Now, here's a really interesting statistic, and we see that this is shifting pretty significantly, is that black females are more likely than white males to have graduated from high school. So generally, no, historically, well, at least the way that the rhetoric is like, well, these white men can do anything they want, and white men control the world. But just statistically, as we're looking at the way things are right now, the trend is certainly toward actually, black females actually getting more higher education, graduating high school, seemingly getting better jobs after that than we see with white men. This is connected to that. A higher proportion of black women aged 25 to 29 hold postgraduate degrees than white men of the same age. So we're going to see this huge demographic shift. And the question is, do people that are really concerned about, inequalities, do they even care about this? Like, do they notice this change or care about what's going to happen to white men after this? And I think about this a lot, especially because I have 2 white male children, and I do worry about them in our world and what they're going to face. One of my kids, because of some conversation he had, was basically told that he shouldn't be doing well because he's a white man and he needs to leave room for women and minorities. And like my kids, they're about as not as sheltered as you can be, but like they, go to a Christian school, very good Christian school, and they're in like Christian environments almost all the time. But my son felt very discouraged and basically was like, maybe I shouldn't be doing well. Maybe I shouldn't get a good job because I'm hurting these other people. And that's the kind of message that young men are getting. I mean, I'm just speaking from one experience, and I'm speaking from experience of a child who just had one conversation like that because he's not around people who are saying things like that. But when you're in a situation where culture is just shouting at you from media and from your education and everywhere that's the case, which statistically in his generation, he's young, it's seemingly not going to be the case at all, because there are right now more minority females getting degrees in higher education than there are for men. Okay. And then work. And work is, here's the area where you see a lot of the talk about the, gender wage gap and the wage gap simplistic, statistical analysis that you hear is totally inaccurate, but I don't want to get too much into that. I just want to say, how is this affecting men? So 40% of women earn more than the typical man. So that doesn't mean that if you average out what women make compared to men are still making more. But that's only a small piece of the puzzle, right? So when you say that, it sounds like, okay, well, men just make more because companies pay more for men. And it's really not true. There are multiple factors involved in pay, but 40% of women are earning more than most men earn. So there is a very significant, and 40% is not insignificant, portion of women who are making a much higher salary than most men. Earnings for men and women are about equal until the birth of the first child. Now, that's an interesting statistic. And, of course, you can interpret that in multiple ways. But the fact is that after a child is born, it's at that point that men tend to make more and women make less. Now, you could attribute that to a couple different things. You could say that is just society and expectations of a patriarchal society, that women spend more time at home with kids than men do. Or you could say there's actually something different about men and women creationally, that women are going to generally be more drawn toward wanting to spend time with kids, especially in very young years, and be more nurturing than the fathers are. It could just be the creational distinctions, differences between men and women. And now here's a quote from the book where he says this, speaking about the gender wage gap issue. He says, there is certainly very little evidence that women are paid less than men for doing the same work in the same way. So when we're talking about differences in wages, there are a lot of factors. And many of those factors are things like, do men work harder? Do men push themselves more? Do they work longer hours? Do they tend toward men naturally tend toward, when they freely pick jobs, do they tend toward jobs that make more money? Those kinds of questions certainly are going to factor in. But what Reeves is going to say is when they're doing the same job the same way, as in they have the same amount of drive, they're putting in the same amount of hours, we don't see any significant differences in salary. And he's not going to say that there's no such thing as sexism in the workplace, or there are no bosses there are no companies or anywhere that would treat women worse. He's not saying that. But when we're looking statistically, there isn't this huge, variance that we see. I mean, realistically, if you could just get away with paying women way less, any good company, if a woman would do the same work for like way less money, why would you not just hire all women? Right? That's what you do if you're a smart businessman. But it doesn't really work that way. Only one in 3 men with only a high school education is now in the labor force. And this is important because, as I said before, if it was the case that men aren't going into higher education because men are just doing other jobs, because there are plenty of bright jobs a guy can do without higher education. I'm not one that's of the opinion that everyone needs to go on to higher education. I say this as one with 3 master's degrees and a PhD. Like, I just kept going, and I can keep going forever because I'm just made that way. I just like it. But a lot of people aren't made that way, and they don't have to be. It is not better to, be an intellectual kind of person than it is to just work a blue-collar job, because the world needs both of those things in order to function. God's given us all unique vocations and callings, and they're all different and all necessary. So it's not... The problem is not just then that, men aren't going to college as much because men are doing other jobs. Like, because they want to go be an electrician or a plumber or a carpenter or whatever, jobs where you're an auto mechanic, jobs where you just don't need a bachelor's degree, so it doesn't matter. It's not that, because it's only one in those 3 people that doesn't go to college that actually is in a labor force and has a job where they're making any kind of living. The biggest fall of employment in recent years is young men between 25 and 34. Okay. So that's, I'm 35, so I guess I just missed that. But that's something that I certainly see looking at men my age and a little younger. The problem is that traditionally male jobs, and we're talking about those jobs that, could be had without a college education. Now, these jobs are often taken by automation and by free trade, so they're shipped overseas. And so you see this in, this is why we have like the Rust Belt. I guess this area, upstate New York is largely the Rust Belt because of the colleges where I'm at. It's a little different. But the towns around here, many of them, the economy was based on some kind of factory that was shipped overseas. And that's what happens everywhere. All right, so automation safe occupations, and we're talking about these are occupations that we don't have the fear of like machines are going to take this over. So some things machines can obviously do, and especially when it comes to like physical labor stuff, because that's what you can create machines to do well, is some physical labor. You can do things, mechanically, and those are things that men often were drawn to. But the occupations where you really can't have automation happen in the same way are things that are predominantly women. And you look at things like healthcare, certainly, I don't think we're going to be having, robot nurses anytime soon. You kind of, the human touch is pretty necessary for people who are sick. So I don't see the kinds of things being automated. Personal services, education. These things are probably not going to be automated in the same way that these other jobs are, but these are predominantly women. So women now who are in the labor force are generally in positions where they're not really going to have the same challenges that men are. So here's what's so important about this data is the gap is continuing to increase. So men are doing worse and women are doing better. And if the trajectory is moving, if nothing changes, that's going to keep moving. Something else that I've also seen, and I think this is a result of this, that I worry about looking at, especially men and women in the church that I see is, and statistics show this as well, that men are getting more conservative and women are getting more liberal, which means that the ideology of men and women is continuing to shift in radically different directions. I see this a lot with young men who are, and when I say conservative, I'm not talking about guys who are, just the kind of rad trad types. These are generally like pretty moderately conservative men who just in the church, they just can't find women because they can't find a woman that shares their values. And that's really, really tough. And I'm thinking specifically about gender and sexuality issues. And it's like they don't want to date women like that because you got to raise kids together and you have to have some kind of common shared values to be able to do that. And I think that's going to increase. So you're going to see a lot more, I think, single men and single women because of those issues. All right. So high skill, high pay jobs of the future are measured largely not by IQ, but by emotional intelligence. So these, EQ rather than IQ, and these tend to be things that women are better at. Women tend to be more emotionally sensitive, emotionally aware of where people are at. This, I know it's a stereotype, but it's very true, that a woman could be like really upset with her husband and try to tell him a bunch of times in various ways without spelling it out word for word. And he goes throughout the day totally oblivious and is like, everything's fine. And then at the end of the day, she's like, what's wrong with you? I've been upset with you about this thing and you haven't done anything about it. And you're like, what? The guy has no clue at all. So men do tend not to pick up on emotional cues as well as women. In terms of IQ, male and female IQ is about the same. There aren't significant variances there. So whereas if the job market is primarily measured by IQ, you have a pretty measured playing field. But if you're talking about emotional intelligence, that again is going to benefit women rather than men. Another economic reality that's also very interesting is men that have been raised poor have a far more difficult time escaping poverty than women who are raised poor. And women could marry up, but it's more than just that. I think women tend to push themselves more in those circumstances. And a lot of that, I think, is having a male role model. Men need to have a strong male role model because we very much follow role models. Then we have, the roles in the home that have radically shifted. So the thing is, in a traditional society, men have a very clear role. And this is what Reeves says here. He says the traditional family was an effective social institution because it made both men and women necessary. And here's the thing: when you have a very clearly defined distinction between the role of the husband and the role of the wife, or the role of the father and the role of the mother, then everybody's necessary. But when they become interchangeable, what inevitably has kind of happened is the man feels useless and doesn't know what his role is. Because, hey, the wife can provide economically too, and maybe she makes more money than me, and maybe she has a better job, and she's also more emotionally attuned to the kids and tends to know their needs better than I do. So what the heck is what's my purpose? I'm just kind of redundant. That's how a lot of guys feel. So culturally, man has been defined generally as the provider. And man, as a provider, as we talked about, psychologically, men like to feel like they are useful, and providing gives men a purpose. My purpose is to protect my wife and kids and provide for them, make sure that their needs are all met. And having a purpose will drive men to do well. When men do not have a purpose, they will not do well. This is why men, traditionally have been the ones to go off and fight in war. I'm going to protect my wife and kids to the point of dying for them. Purpose. Protection is a purpose that men generally need in some way. So this has been dismantled by securing the economic independence of women. Now, I'm not making any claims here, about what women should do in the workplace. That's not, I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not going to tell you how to fix our socioeconomic issues. But I'm just simply spelling this out because it's important to be aware of where men are at and what's happening to women, so that they can be ministered to where they're at. So I'm not giving you the solution to all of these things. I'm just laying out the realities of what the church has to deal with in terms of where men are at today, to recognize these needs so we can, as a church, meet these needs where we can. Women are breadwinners in 41% of U.S. households. That's getting pretty close to half. And so that really undermines how men have generally viewed themselves in our society. It generally really undermines how men have viewed their use as, I need to be the provider. In half of families where both parents work full-time, mothers earn as much or more than fathers. So if you have both parents working, again, the father often feels redundant. You see this a lot. He doesn't feel like he has a real purpose. I did ask this question. I know this sounds terrible, I guess, but I did ask this question to young men once just to hear their responses, college guys, about how they would feel if their wife made more than them. And all of them said they don't want that. Like, all of them said, yeah, it would make me feel bad as a man. Now, you can respond to that in a couple of ways, right? You can respond to that as, well, that's just toxic masculinity. You just feel like you need to be better than everybody else. But knowing men and talking to these guys, what's the reasoning? It's not because I'm better than women, I need to be making more money. It's because they want to feel like they're needed, because they want to provide. And they want to feel like they want to marry into a situation where they feel like the woman actually needs them there. Okay. Husbands without jobs are at a far higher risk of seeing marriages end than in the past. And it's not the same kind of thing with a woman without a job. So we're as much as we talk about, trying to make the equality in these various ways. A woman, as much as she wants to say that she views men and women as the same, and that whatever a man could do, a woman could do, whatever a woman could do, a man can do, it is a fact that women do look down on men who don't work in a different way than men look at their wives who don't work. It's just not the same. And you can blame it on patriarchal culture, but that's just the fact. Twice as many divorces are initiated by women as men. And if there's one thing I could say that the church needs to be aware of in terms of where men are at, more than anything else, it's this. There's just an increasing amount, from what I've seen, is these young Christian couples get married, and married somewhat probably naively, and the men are like really excited about the marriage. Within a year or two, the woman decides she wants out. Well, why? At least in these cases that I've seen, oftentimes she feels trapped in a marriage. Now that she's had sex, she realizes she could do that with other people, and it would make her feel pretty good if she feels like she's hot and has other people to hit on her and do this with her as well, and then she leaves her husband. And there's often encouragement from other women friends that would be a good thing to do to kind of liberate herself. And I'm not talking here about abusive marriage situations. I certainly believe that there is plenty of marital abuse. But I'm talking about a different kind of situation here. So there are situations where a woman is often encouraged to leave the husband or to cheat on her husband. And I've seen this a lot. And what I don't see is the same thing happening with men. I don't see guys telling each other, like, yeah, leave your wife. I just don't see that. And maybe it's circles that I'm in, but I think the statistics demonstrate this to be the case. Twice as many divorces are initiated by women. And, back in very traditional societies, only men could initiate divorce. A woman couldn't do it at all. So you kind of move from that to now women are initiating the majority of divorces. Fewer than 1 in 5 American adults think that marriage is essential to living a fulfilling life. So that's just the downfall of marriage and the family in general. And no, I don't think that means because they're pursuing, monastic orders or something. That would be another question. Okay. And unmarried men generally have worse health, higher unemployment rates, and weaker social networks. And drug-related deaths among them has doubled since 2010. So marriage is good for men. Marriage is something that most men need. Now, I don't say every man, because again, there's, there are monastic kind of callings, but the majority of men do much better when they are married. And that's why what worries me about what I'm seeing in the church is more liberal women and more conservative men is that there are going to be more and more men who just can't find a woman, and it's going to have all of these other profound psychological impacts. So it affects their employment, how they connect with others, how they make friendships. So we need to be very conscious, I think, in making ways of making friendships, of going out of our way to make networks of men and young men and single men, whether young or old. Okay, so I mentioned this before. Divorce psychologically is far harder on men than it is on women. There are a number of studies that show this. More men than women. So this is significant because this goes very much against what has been portrayed in media. And guess what? Media's not always right. Maybe media lies to you. So this says that more men than women say that being married is very important to them as a future goal. So more men actually are valuing marriage, especially younger men, as a future goal than women. And that's 58% versus 47% of women. So that really shifts the narrative that you see out here that, women want to be married and all men want to do is just sleep around and they don't care about commitment. They don't care about women. It's not true. Statistically, it's not true. Marriage rates of men between 40 and 44 with a high school education or less has dropped by more than 20 percentage points in the last 40 years. So these are all really, really significant to just understand where men are at today in our society, and that there is a real crisis, and we need to be facing this crisis and helping men through this crisis. Biological differences. And here's the final point of notes, because I'm getting close to an hour here. But men tend to be more aggressive, tend to take more risks, and have a higher sex drive. Those things kind of are obvious. like I say they're obvious because you can just kind of see and looking generally at how men and women act. I see this with, taking more risks. Like boys often do kind of dumb things, even from young ages. Like, I'm going to jump off my bed at my top bunk from my bed and see what happens. Guys just tend to do these things more. Not that women never do, but this is why men are created to do this largely because we are the ones who choose to go out and fight and take risks. Somebody needs to be the risk taker and somebody needs to be more cautious. We work well together that way. You see this, I think, financially too. I know a lot of men, and I know some women like this, but I see more cases where the man financially is a risk taker and is ready to invest in certain things, and the wife is like, don't do that, that's not safe. We want to just keep our money in a savings account and that's it. So this comes across just in I think life experiences pretty obviously. Males are more interested in things and women are more interested in people generally. And you see this, what's interesting about this particular observation is it's something that can be seen even from the youngest ages of children. I mean, you can watch the eye movements of young boys and girls before they can even really articulate things with words in terms of what they're observing, what they're looking at when they watch things. And women tend to watch faces and boys tend to watch things. And this is why women tend to be more kind of honed in on people's emotions and where they're at emotionally, and guys are more about like, what does that thing do? That car is cool. It does cool things. It goes fast. Whereas women tend to like want the toy of the baby doll more than men do generally. Okay. Then here's another, interesting fact about men in marriage is that testosterone levels fall in men who get married, and do so even more if a man spends a significant amount of time with children. Now, I guess you could take this in a weird manosphere kind of way and say, like, that means that marriage is bad for men because we need high testosterone levels. No, the point is, like, testosterone, part of it is there to win yourself a wife, and then your family, your wife and your kids, have a kind of civilizing effect on you as a man. And that's a good thing. Other biological differences, and this is, if you've ever listened to Jordan Peterson, I'm sure you've heard this before, and that is, even under conditions of gender equality, we're looking specifically at studies that have been done in Finland and Norway, which are kind of the most progressive countries in terms of gender issues that there are. Women tend to choose different jobs more than men. And so even when you're looking at, because the argument today is like, well, the only reason that women do different things than men is because women are told to do that, so that there are societal expectations that differ. So if you look at something like Simone de Beauvoir's work, The Second Sex, which it pushes this idea that men and women aren't really substantially different, that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. So woman is a series of these societal expectations that women have to do this, this, and this, and that's all that drives the real gender differences. And it's this kind of patriarchal society that has decided to oppress and hold women down. Which I'm, by the way, going to be doing a whole talk on de Beauvoir's work, because I think it's really essential for understanding a lot of our ideas in the world today. But so the thesis then is, if you give men and women equal opportunities, they're basically going to equalize themselves, and that's just not true. Even if you have equality of opportunity, you don't have equality of outcome, because men and women actually statistically tend to do different things and want different things. So here's a quote from the book. Sex differences were largest in richer and more gender equal countries. So where you have more opportunities and more money, the gender differences increase rather than the opposite. So it's the opposite of what you'd expect to see if that kind of de Beauvoir narrative was correct. So there's the summary of what's in this book. And there's plenty I can say in terms of where we can go, and let me know if you want me to do this in terms of a church and trying to address these issues. The bishop of the AALC he did his dissertation on this issue of men in the church, he dealt with some of these statistics and some other things. So I'd be happy to have a conversation with him, get him on with me, so we could talk about maybe some of this and how to address it as a church. So just let me know if you want me to do that. But as we're facing the challenges of our world, and facing especially churches that are getting smaller, but churches that are also getting smaller in terms of the male population, because in churches, females far outweigh males. And that has been a historical statistic too. So that's not something that is just new. And people have tried to come up with different ways to address this. Some people have said it's the fault of contemporary worship music because it's too feminine, or I'm not a fan of that kind of music. But I'm not sure that that's really the reason either. I'm not sure that really is keying in on what is the primary difference, or primary reason for this. I think there are probably a lot of things, and I don't pretend to have all of the answers either. But we do need to be aware of the situation of where men are at. And I'll tell you, if you're a man listening, and like guys who listen, people listen to this program, it's far more men than women. That's the reality. I do have women that listen, and I'm just as happy to have women listen as men. But it is just the fact that it probably is more men who are drawn to the kind of stuff that I'm doing here. But if you have an opportunity to encourage a younger man, kind of take somebody under your wing in some way, like do it. really do it. Encourage them. Lead them toward the good. Lead them toward community, the church, to Christ, the forgiveness of sins, to meaning, purpose in Christ. And try to bring them away from the brink of that anger that I see in a lot of guys. It's really, really unhealthy. And it's not the route you want to go. Well, thanks so much for listening and or watching. And I hope you enjoyed this talk. And we'll see you in the next one. God bless.